When you think of Wolves, you probably don't think much about them. However, whether it's star players or iconic managers, Wolves have proven themselves as Premier League quality. This is team 4 of explaining the entire history of the Premier League. We're doing this with every single team, so if you want to see yours, make sure to subscribe. In 1877, Wolves were established as St Luke's Football Club and was made for schoolboys. A couple of years later, they merged with another club to form Wolverhampton Wanderers. They found early success, winning the FA Cup in their first season. They were a part of the founding members of the Football League, and by the beginning of World War I, they won their second cup, despite struggling in the second division. The war didn't do any favours as they failed to bounce back and were thus relegated to the third division in 1923. It was a long road back to the top. However, they managed to bounce back quickly and earn promotion to the second division. A mix of prolific scorers helped Wolves go back up to the top division in 1932. They managed to stabilise and steadily progress up to the climax of World War II. Following the war, players were affected. However, with rising youth players that developed during the war, Wolves were ready to fight for the top, entering what most fans refer to as the Golden Era. Stan Koulis, the former Wolves player, was appointed as manager in 1948 at just 31 years old. He brought a disciplined and fast style of play, using his famous motto, "There's only one way to play football, fast and forward." They won yet another FA Cup in 1949 and began to dominate the English League, winning the title in 54, 58 and 59. They were the most dominant team in the 50s and were praised for not just their innovation on the pitch, but outside the team too. They were one of the first to install floodlights and organise high-profile friendlies against other European giants, being highly publicised. The BBC named Wolves as champions of the world, which inspired the creation of the European Cup just a few years later. They topped everything off by winning yet another FA Cup and Charity Shield in 1960 to mark the end of a dominant decade. However, what was to happen next would completely change Wolves forever. After the 1960 FA Cup win, the squad began to decline. The players were ageing and their replacements didn't replicate the performances. Stan Koulis tried to turn this team around, but it couldn't be done and he was resultantly sacked in 1964, marking the end of a dominant 16-year era. They scrambled for a replacement, but it was too late. Wolves were relegated for the first division that season. They struggled in the second division as their road back to glory seemed to be disappearing. They came back up in 68, where under Bill McGarry, who managed to stabilise the club and bring in a disciplined management style, they finished 4th in 1971, qualifying for the European Cup. They shocked everyone by making their way all the way to the final, beating the likes of Juventus on the way, before losing to Spurs in the final. Wolves were praised for this run and became one of the most supported clubs in the world, averaging 30,000 people per match. The Molineux remained as a fortress and was seen as a threat to other teams. It was all looking good. However, warning signs began to appear through the late 70s. Finances weren't used correctly, poor investments and mounting debts. It all built up until 1980, where Wolves were never the same again. Wolves were bought by the Batty brothers in 1982, who said they were going to fix the club. However, they had literally zero football experience. A ton of false promises led Wolves to completely crumble. Back-to-back relegations saw Wolves drop from the first to a fourth division in just 4 years. Most players left, attendance dropped, and in 1986, the Batty brothers walked out. The club was put in administration and could barely operate. It came to a crisis point where they were literally minutes away from being completely liquidated. But then, at minutes to midnight, came a hope. Jack Hayward, a local businessman, Derek Dugan, an ex-player, and Wolverhampton City Council all played their part in buying the club and keeping it alive. They were saved. However, they still had a long way to go. They slowly rebuilt and began to climb up the ranks. By 1990, they had earned their spot back in the second division. At this point, Jack Hayward had bought 100% of the club and was determined to bring Wolves back to the top. The 90s consisted of a lot of trial and error. They had a few chances in the playoffs, however with managers coming and going, they never really posed a serious threat. That was until 2003 where they finally done it. They beat Sheffield United and returned to the Premier League once again. Their Premier League dominance lasted a whole 8 months before they were relegated back to the Championship. They spent a few more years in the Championship rebuilding for the Prem, and after getting promoted and securing safety in the Premier League in 2010, they were here to stay. The 2010s was an absolute rollercoaster for Wolves. They scraped survival in 2011 before going down in 2012, not once but twice, as they would see another back-to-back relegation, dropping into League One. This sudden drop was a shock for many. However, after dominating League One, they spent the next 4 years rebuilding, and with rising talents like Ruben Neves and Raul Jimenez, as well as hiring manager Nuno Santo, who made the most out of these players, they dominated the championship in 2018, winning with 99 points. But this wasn't just a one-off. In their first season back, they finished a historic 7th place, qualifying for the Europa League. They doubled down the next season, finishing 7th again, as well as reaching the Europa League quarter-finals. The next season saw them lose Raul Jimenez to injury. This derailed their entire season, finishing 13th. Things didn't improve, and in November 2021, Nuno left Wolves to later join Spurs that season. There were multiple replacements for Nuno, however none really replicated his achievements. At one point, Wolves were at the bottom of the table during Christmas of 2022, however managed to recover, finishing 13th. Last season they finished 16th, an underwhelming result. And now with departures of star players like Cunha and Aït-Nouri, how will they do this season? While you think about that, why not watch this video right here?